Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday, April 8th. Welcome to Mock Interview and Feedback number 121, featuring a community and marketing manager here in Mike. My name is Albert. I am the host of Albert's List, and I'll be your co-host today with Corey of CareerShakers.com. If you've been with us since the beginning, thank you so much for being here. This is our 121st edition. If this is your first, welcome. The way we handle these is we found ourselves a candidate to do a mock interview. He has sent his resume, he has sent a job description, and Corey will ask the questions. Mike is going to respond, and then we will get feedback. If you have any questions as well and you would like to ask them in the webinar chat, or if you have any general interview questions, feel free to put them in the webinar chat as well. This is being recorded, so it's going to be going on YouTube later for your reference. And if you'd like to be a future person who gets interviewed, feel free to send your resume to me via the Eventbrite form that got you here in the first place, and we'll get you set up. It's a competitive market right now, so anything you can do to put yourself above the competition as you interview is only going to help. So without further ado, Corey, over to you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. We appreciate it. And if you're looking for other mock interviews, please do check out the Alberts List YouTube channel as well as my YouTube channel as well. We'll put the links in the chat, but it's Career Shakers, all one word, or Alberts List in YouTube. We've got different mock interviews for like sales roles, marketing positions, product management, technical program management. So if you're interested in other types of roles, you can check those out as well. And I also just posted a new video on like a high level overview of the different types of sales roles. I mentioned this because originally we were going back and forth, but between what kind of job Mike wanted to practice interviewing for. He actually already did an interview for a SDR type role or a business development representative role. So if anyone's looking for more information on like what a sales role is, what an SDR role is, how much money you can make working in sales, how to break into sales, I do have a video that I posted last week, just in case you guys are interested in a sales career. But first, let's give Mike a huge round of applause for both your entertainment and education purposes today. He will be practicing this player safety policy manager role at EA Games. And I just threw that in the chat here so you all can take a look at it. Um, I think it's somewhat related to marketing and community management, but it does fall under like the risk and compliance and global affairs organization. But we'll be practicing that job description today. And before we get into the interview, why don't we have Mike give everyone a non-interview introduction of himself, as well as talk a little bit about some of the types of roles, locations, and companies that you're looking for, Mike. That way, if anyone in the audience connects with you or has any potential opportunities, they can send them your way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Mike. Yeah, so I'm from the Bay Area originally, living in Austin for the past 8 years. I moved with a gaming company that I was working for in Emeryville. I started in customer support, and then I worked as a community manager for the past 8 years. And I've been looking for work for, oh man, yeah, we had layoffs about last year around the spring, so it's getting close to a year now. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
And then what kind of roles are you looking for? And
Oh,
then what kind
right,
of
absolutely.
companies?
Sorry. So, I'm looking for, uh, gosh, so with community management, it's pretty niche in the gaming industry, but there's a lot of crossover with you get marketing experience, customer support experience. So I'm looking primarily for maybe associate or manager level marketing roles, looking to pivot out of gaming potentially, as well as potentially staying in gaming as well. Community manager roles, customer support manager, customer support account manager. Really kind of trying to lean on both my community management slash marketing background, as well as sort of like the production side, with sort of the customer support, more of that customer support background. Yeah.
Okay. And then are you open to relocation or is it Austin only?
No, I'm open to relocate. Like I said, yeah, I relocated from the Bay Area to Austin, and I can move again, potentially, or hybrid or remote.
Okay, great. So if anyone's got any opportunities in the marketing or community space, please let Mike know. And then I guess also sales too, since you just interviewed for a sales role.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you have anything in sales, please contact us and we'll put you in touch with Mike. All right. And as Albert mentioned, I've got some interview questions drafted up that we can practice today. But if you have any questions for me or for Mike, please put those in the chat and we'll go ahead and answer those. It could be related to practice questions you want Mike to do, or if you just have general interview questions for me. Happy to answer whatever it is of most interest for everyone in the attendees here. And how it's going to work is I'll just pretend to be an interviewer. So I'll ask Mike an interview question. I usually don't give any hints unless you get totally stuck. And feel free to read your notes or like reference other documents if you want to, because this is totally for practice. That way, at least you can get some feedback on your overall answers. And then after the end of each question, I'll give some feedback from like a recruiter or career coach perspective. And then we'll go question by question until we reach the top of the hour.
Cool. Sounds good.
So, Mike, can you tell me about your policy management experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, pretty much every aspect of sort of what I've done at Wargaming touches policy in one way or another. So really my history as a customer support representative as well as a community manager. As in support, it was more kind of involved with shaping and getting feedback on existing policies and refining customer support policies and workflows to sort of make them more either more streamlined, reduce turnaround time, remove points of friction for customers or for players in this context. It, sort of in the community context, more macro levels. So I was involved with things like account hack investigations, both in customer service and later on in community. As far as trust and safety in like a gaming space goes, we were an online game publisher, so you get your typical foul language, in-game like bullying type stuff where people just misbehaving, but folks can get kind of crazy online, as I'm sure everyone is aware. So that could turn into like coordinated harassment campaigns, like as far as we had a streamer program of about 200 sponsored content creators, YouTubers, streamers, etc. And they would get like the groups of players would sort of work together to both harass them in and outside of the game. So there was a lot of investigation involved with sort of tracking like where does the EULA in terms of service end for enforceability for sort of these types of targeted harassment campaigns that exist outside of the game space where there's logs for all the actions that take place. So with that in mind, I was involved with a lot of like revising existing policy, revising support policy, and then both revising game rules and terms of service. Kind of in cooperation with global publishing and making sure that this kind of is uniform across all the regions as far as the EULA in terms of service. So small level investigations spanning all the way to being a stakeholder and revising global trust and safety policy.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of like player policy or player safety policies that maybe you were involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a time in which there was an anniversary for the game, and we were tasked by Global with an amnesty campaign that involved winning back lapsed players who were permanently banned for minor game violations. So working with legal and global publishing leadership, as well as publishing leadership from other regions, we worked together to draft a new policy basically to allow players who were previously permanently banned under the EULA to rejoin on a sort of a probationary basis and enjoy access to all their old in-game goods and their accounts and participate so long as they didn't then continue to relapse and fall back into their own behavior. And that drove initially like about probably 20% win back for lapsed players that would previously wouldn't have returned to the game.
Okay. Can you tell me what that policy was specifically and like how you were involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so essentially revising the existing game rules, which worked on a strike system where after they accumulated a certain amount of strikes, they were not allowed to repeal or to appeal those permanent game bans under any circumstances. So basically, getting buy-in from legal to revise the language to allow this new idea from global leadership, which is this amnesty to allow players back in. So the policy essentially was removing this 5 strikes and you're out permanent suspension policy and revising it to allow players basically back one last final chance to return, and then getting the appropriate buy-in both from legal and again from publishing leadership going all the way up to global.
Got it. Okay. Great. Thank you. All right. So this is like a different version of a tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume style question. The reason why I went with a more specific question, which is tell me about your player safety and policy experience, is just because from Mike's resume as a recruiter, I would notice that he's doing a bit of a career switch because he was a community manager before and then he does marketing freelance. And so that's why I would ask something a little bit more specific in this case, just because I would want to know what are the transferable skills and experiences that Mike has, and then he can connect those dots for me and show me how he meets the qualifications and why he'd be a really good fit for this role. And there is some overlap in terms of the community management piece as well as customer support, because you do touch some of the player policies and player safety and things like that. So I think Mike did a good job of highlighting where he was involved in certain areas. And of course, he was working in the gaming industry, which makes it like a great industry fit for him. So he's not just, luckily, he's not switching industries and jobs. That would be super difficult. So in this case, he's just switching roles with transferable experience. And he leaned heavily on the gaming experience in order to make it as transferable and relatable as possible, which is ideal. And then you can tell based on my follow-up questions, right, which is like, can you give me some specific policies that you worked on as it relates to player safety? Those are things that hopefully, Mike, you can just pull in from the beginning next time, just to show them that, hey, my job title was community manager, but really I've also done a lot of player safety things and I've been involved in certain policies. And then as you can tell, and then you can kind of give them the details as to like, okay, what specifically were you responsible for? Because as your overview has given, you've told me about player policies and then how potentially one of them was going to be revised. But I still don't know what specifically you did in your role. And like, was this like, how did you work with legal, or maybe legal had some questions, or how did you, or maybe you were responsible for the communication to the players and letting them know that there was a change in the policy and how certain things could be adjusted, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. So trying to pull out those examples and then tell me specifically what you did. Hopefully it aligns with this job description, right? Which is deep knowledge of player safety, being involved in terms of like stakeholder management, internal communications, working with the engineering teams, right? So anything you can touch on that overlaps with this job description would be super helpful in terms of the level of involvement you've had with the changes in policy, or maybe even how they were initially created, because maybe you were there from the beginning when the company first started, right? And then maybe you did help out in terms of creating the initial player safety policies, right?
Gotcha.
And any types of those details would help you show them that you're a really good fit.
Okay.
I know Albert mentioned that the answer is a little bit on the longer side, but it was a little bit longer because I did ask some follow-up questions. Ideally, if someone asks you, like, tell me about yourself or what's your experience with X, Y, and Z, you want to be around like a minute and a half, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. But I did ask Mike some follow-ups, which is why the answer was a bit longer. And then obviously, this I don't think Mike had prepared specifically for this practice interview. I know we were bouncing back and forth between the BDR and this role, so that's also why I think Mike was trying to find the appropriate examples. All right, so let's go to the next question here. So based on your experience working in the gaming industry, can you describe like certain online safety challenges that players would face, and then how we as a company at EA could create certain policies or features in the game to help keep players safe?
Yes. So, particularly with more and more games existing online, the protection that players get from things like the ESRB rating being, anywhere from for kids to T for teen to mature, and things like PEGI, which is the European version, that ends at online ratings not being or online interactions not being rated. So there's this whole large gray area of what isn't is or isn't appropriate for for players of all ages to be exposed to. So you both have to consider the implications of um, bad actors looking to do harm or get information from minors, as well as all of your typical type harassment, just foul language, those types of things. Like, they're all things you have to consider and have protections in place for. But with things like sort of packet sniffing and let's call it like emerging technologies are coming out that make this type of work or putting these types of protections in place more difficult. And to give you an example of that, specifically in the context of a gaming publisher, World of Tanks is an online game. Players can create a free account and log in, so they can keep creating accounts as much as they want. So there are protections in place to be able to track these players over accounts and try to track bad actors, who may be trying to circumvent whatever automation is in place to prevent abuse. Previously, it was possible simply to track players both with their IP address and their hardware ID for their machine or their MAC address. However, as VPNs get more popular and available, virtual machines, players are able to spoof their IP, they're able to spoof their hardware ID. It becomes more and more difficult to identify problematic players and permanently revoke their access or prevent them from accessing your product. So coming up with creative solutions to be able to track these types of players and identify them and make sure without a doubt that you aren't removing someone who shouldn't be removed from your game unfairly. So being able to navigate that type of ambiguity in sort of detailed investigations and using that human touch to make the distinction is I think critical.
Okay. Um, what types of what are specific player safety policies that you think would be applicable to EA as opposed to other gaming companies?
So some specific policies for EA I think it would be product specific. So let's say, for example, EA owns Maxis, who publishes The Sims. There's a degree of online interaction there. So in that context, it would probably be more important to there's a lot of microtransactions involved with The Sims. They have a big DLC store. So in that context, probably account security is important. So putting multiple layers of protections in place and encouraging players to use them, such as two-factor authentication, SMS confirmation, all of that good stuff. Regularly, sending out CRMs to motivate players to change their passwords, things like that. That just small steps that can reduce the volume of abuse from a account security perspective, because players in-game goods are extremely important to them in things like The Sims, where they're building up this lifetime of in-game goods over potentially a decade of playing. So in that specific context for EA, one of their products, I think protecting the account security and ensuring that their in-game goods and their purchases, their billing information, all of that financial information is secure, and that is a big priority for one aspect of EA's players.
Okay, great. So, I really like all of the examples that Mike had. I mean, granted, I don't work in the space, but I assume they're all accurate and true, which is awesome. So I think the only thing I could add here would be is if we could organize them into certain categories from the beginning, just to help you organize your thoughts closer together. So based on what you've shared, I think there's like number one would be like, I guess, player protection policies around cheating. Second one sounds like security, in terms of like account access to protect all of their in-game purchases and things like that. And then I think the third broad category of player safety could fall under like I guess like account management, because you mentioned how players could, um, if the game is free, they could continuously create new accounts if
Hmm.
they were to get like banned or receive certain number of strikes, and they could basically game the system in a certain way,
Yeah.
right? So I think if you were to organize it for the interviewer up front, right, you could say, oh yeah, so based on my experience, there's at least three major categories of like player safety and player safety policies in which I think EA should be considering.
Gotcha.
First would be, this. Some examples would be blah, 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 blah. How you would prevent them, two-factor authentication, blah, 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 blah. Second category would be blah, 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 blah. Some examples of this that I've seen, boom, 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 boom. EA could prevent some of these with blah, 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 right? I think you have all the right answers. The only thing I would say is just getting it a little bit organized. That
Hmm.
way, it's not like you're firing off really good ideas, but in no particular order. That
Gotcha.
would
Yeah,
show
yeah.
them that you're super well organized and that you've been able to take a step back and provide like a high level strategy as to how to approach some of these broader categories. And then, of course, if you have time, because you don't want your answer to be too long, that's why I say three is good, like three general categories, because it
Hmm.
still hopefully should fall within about 5 minutes. Obviously, I'm sure there's way, way more, but if you could start with three broader categories, and then you can always ask them, did you want me to go into some other categories, or do you feel like this is sufficient, right, for this
Okay.
example?
Gotcha. Okay.
And
So
then
yeah,
I mentioned that because someone last time said, how do you make the interview sound more conversational and make it flow more like a conversation to make it feel like you and the interviewer have a really good connection? That's one way to do it, is you could say, there's three broad categories. Here they are. Here are some examples. Be mindful of the time and be like, so those are just three categories. There's some other ones as well. Did you want me to keep going? I just want to be respectful of time. And then
gotcha.
you can
Okay.
kind of see what
Interesting.
the
Yeah,
interviewer
yeah.
says, and then you guys can have this little back and forth. And then that's when it kind of feels more like, oh, this wasn't really an interview. It was more like me talking to my boss and, throwing out ideas, and we went back and forth.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
so yeah, I think overall though, Mike's examples are super solid. They're all really relevant. It's just organizing them now into different categories.
Yeah, I definitely like, when a question kind of takes me by surprise a little bit, I feel like I'm going into a stream of consciousness a little bit, and I struggle with like, I almost like, I feel like I can hear myself like, all right, I'm trying to rein it in and get to the conclusion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That can definitely be hard. I think one way that I do it is if you can tell what kind of question it is, then you can figure out how you want to best approach it. So obviously, if it's a behavioral question, tell me about a time when you blah 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 blah. You're like, okay, that's STAR
Hmm.
method. I don't need to worry about categories,
Yeah.
right? I can just situation, task, action, result. But if it's more broad, like in this case, it was like a hypothetical, which was based on your experience, what types of player safety policies have you seen in your industry, and then how would we as EA try to handle those? That should be like, oh, okay, this is not STAR. They want me to give examples of stuff. Okay,
Hmm.
so that means I should probably, if I can, try to organize this in some way. What's the best way to organize this? Maybe types of player policies. That would probably be one way. And then, okay, so let me, can I get a second to organize my thoughts? And they'll say, yes, no problem. And then you can think out loud, right? Like, okay, I'm
Hmm.
thinking there's like certain categories of player policies. One, two, three. Yeah, okay. So
Hmm.
this is how I would think about it.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I think overall, your answer is great. It's just the organization behind it is the only way I think that we could enhance it, and make it
Mhm.
better.
Okay.
Speaking of that, let's try a behavioral question.
Sure thing.
Can you tell me about a time when you had to either update or create a player safety policy at one of your organizations?
Yes. So a good example of that would be in customer support. Uh, d- they launched a new type of game mode for World of Tanks, and um, unbeknownst to the publisher, there was a way to. So this game mode launched with a really desirable in-game incentive in the form of like a high-level vehicle that had really good performance. And the only way to obtain this incentive was to complete a series of group challenges in this new game mode. So as opposed to motivating player engagement, cooperation, inviting friends, win back, retention, all of that good stuff. It actually ended up motivating a very elaborate string of in-game rigging campaigns in which players would all jump onto a Discord server together and they would basically cheat and throw the game in order to help one another complete in-game objectives, which was not working as how the developer intended. So, as a customer support representative, this was sort of out of my scope at the time. However, I and another couple of CSRs who were really knowledgeable about the game, have been playing for a long time, started documenting these, conducting these in-depth investigations, and then documenting these instances of this rigging that was taking place, for which there simply were not policies about before in the EULA and the game rules. And through sort of, let's say, about 2 weeks of pressing leadership, documenting, trying to escalate, we ended up pushing forward this the results of this big investigation to the product specialist, who brought it to the attention of leadership. It went up the chain, and they ended up releasing a big policy to essentially be able to issue temporary game bans, discourage this behavior, remove the, let's say, illegally obtained vehicles, and ultimately like fix the sentiment problem that was coming from players basically cheating to get this really cool tank. So being able to do that from being a CSR who does not shape any policy, and influencing this really important policy about something that players are really passionate about, was a really sort of rewarding feeling, and seeing the results of this immediately take place was really satisfying.
So can you walk me through specifically what you were involved with in changing and updating this policy?
Yeah, so the documentation, illustrating the sentiment problem that was coming as a result of this that was happening, because leadership and the community team were aware that this was a problem, but I think the severity and the scope of it wasn't quite communicated, or there was a misunderstanding there. So being able to illustrate the severity using that intimate product knowledge and that intimate community knowledge, in order to sort of like qualify that feedback, and then provide evidence of all of the, like, just again provide evidence of the scope, because the results of the investigation showed just how many players were involved in this big cheating campaign. So more on the boots on the ground side, as opposed to actually participating in the drafting of the policies at that point. But the results of the boots on the ground work directly contributed to that policy being created.
Okay. Got it. And then how do you measure the success of the policy?
Measuring the success of that policy, difficult to measure, I think, immediately, because it ultimately ends up impacting long-term like sentiment and player satisfaction, right? So, in the longer term, I'd say, it illustrates that the community team, the product team, are engaged with their product and know what's going on. They understand the needs of their players. So hopefully, and ideally, this contributed to retention, reducing churn, potentially a bump in maybe short-term monthly active users if they saw, sort of got wind of this through Reddit and through the grapevine, that like, oh wow, Wargaming like really cares about making this thing right, fixing this boo-boo that they made, by creating this whole situation in the first place.
Okay, cool. So we'll move to the feedback section here. So one thing that I just want to point out for people in general is, if possible, try to make the endings of your story unpredictable and exciting. So in this case, the question was, tell me about a time you had to update or change a policy, and how you did it. So obviously, the ending of your story, I know, is that you updated or changed the policy. So if possible, then take it one step further, which is kind of what I was asking Mike as my last follow-up question, which is, how do you measure the success or the impact of this updated policy and know that it was either the right thing to do or it was beneficial for the game and the community and the players. So in this case, if you can talk about how for this expansion or this event, this limited event, right? I assume you guys had metrics because you had to put the business case together as to how many people were cheating and using whatever in the inappropriate methods in order to obtain the final reward of the skin. You must have data, therefore, that tells you how many active players are participating in the limited time event, how many limited edition tanks people are getting, etc. So I would assume there's a way to measure after you change the policy, was the player base did the player base increase or decrease for the specific event after the change in the policy? Was the I don't know, maybe this was even raised because players were complaining too much about how there were so many other people that already had the skin and it was becoming not fun to play if you didn't have the skin, and then therefore they were more incentivized to also cheat. Who knows, right? But there must have been some way in which this was flagged to the company as to why it's not good for players. So I assume there's some way to track like the before versus the after, which would be a great way to wrap up the story. In addition to saying you helped update this policy and the feedback was great, right?
Mhm. I'm trying to think of like, God, because not only was it so long ago, like, so I wasn't I didn't have visibility on like those long-term KPIs that something like that would have impacted, right? So
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of like, how to articulate that in like, like in a neat way to kind of wrap up the story, right? Because, ultimately, like, so I guess for context, like, it's high, like it's like high level, like competitive gaming content, right? It was supposed to be something that the target group for that activity, that engagement, or that activation was, highly engaged, highly skilled, highly engaged players, because it's supposed to be really hard to get this tank and it's supposed to be like really good, right? So in that context, I would say like this being easily gameable and like manipulable, could, like, basically not inaction in this context could have resulted in like a really big churn of the most highly engaged segment of players. So like theoretically, the result there is like they didn't lose players as fast as they could have, because
Hmm.
at this time, like, the product had already been around for about 10 years, so it was in a period of declining MAU. So monthly active users were already going down, so it's kind of
Yeah.
it's a bit of a wash as far as like, well, how much did we like stymie the flow, like, did we plug, was the plug big enough for the leak? Like, we didn't lose as much players in that context as we could have, but it's difficult for me to quantify that.
Yeah. Well, in this case, because it was a while ago, you could make a rough estimate, right?
Hmm.
Um, you could say before the policy, our speaking frankly, our monthly active users were on the decline because our game was out for 10 years. But after the policy change, we did notice a small decrease
Hmm.
in the churn each month, or for that particular month after the policy change, because this was originally flagged to us by whatever player
Hmm.
complaints about the pervasiveness of this whatever high performance tank, that was ruining whatever player
So maybe
experiences.
prevented a potential churn of up to like 20%, like something like that, like a prevented churn, I guess would be.
I wouldn't say prevented churn because that's hard to measure, but you could just
Right.
say like the the decrease in MAUs the following month was lower than anticipated, or lower than
Okay.
the previous
Yeah.
month after the policy change, right?
Okay.
That way it's like you don't have numbers, but also you didn't lie because it did, like, it was still going down. To your
Right.
point, right? It's still going down,
Right.
but like it didn't go down as much because it
Hmm.
shows that Warhammer actually cares about its player base,
Hmm.
and took action towards this particular event. All right, but in general, overall answer is good. STAR, very clear. I would just say just make sure the ending is unpredictable if you can,
Okay.
in terms of all the other stuff. And then of course don't forget to add in what you were particularly involved with, right? You're doing a
Hmm.
very good job of giving me the overview of the situation, but I have to ask you, oh, well, what specifically did you do, Mike, in terms of updating or changing this policy?
Got it.
Okay, question from Albert. Have you ever created a player policy that backfired? what happened and what did you do to mitigate the risks?
Let's see. So I guess an easy sort of a low-hanging fruit, let's say. At one point, there was a global structural change in which European publishing took over North American publishing operations, and this involved merging all of the North American and European social channels, YouTube, Instagram, Twitch, etc., identifying which one performed the best, and then merging the smaller channel into it by essentially asking players to follow the new channel. So this was incentivized. We came up with an idea to drive additional registration or sort of retain as much of this audience during the transition as possible by giving out promo codes for some small amount of in-game goods for a limited number of players who signed up for the new channel and redeemed this promo code. The idea sounded innocent enough on paper. However, being used to dealing with a much smaller audience in North America compared to Europe after the merge, we simply did not predict the volume of interest, like the amount of interest in redeeming these codes, and the rate at which they would be redeemed. So these codes that were meant to be sort of for both North American and European players to celebrate the merge of these channels, this new exciting thing that was going on, turned out to be a negative experience for all of the North American players because the codes were released during European prime time and were all redeemed by the time North American players were back from school and work and etc. and their lives. So this campaign that was meant to celebrate ended up being really divisive, and sort of in order to mitigate the risks from that or to come back from it, was a simple fix of basically getting folks on a Zoom call late or on a Teams meeting late, getting product and biz dev to approve generating X number of additional codes, and rolling them out at a staggered time frame moving forward from that. So there would be a drop both for the North American time zone and the European time zone, and it repaired most of that initial sentiment damage, and probably I'd say about 20 to 40% of players on average, I guess, of subscribers were kind of retained or gained to the new channel from the old channels before those old channels were sunset.
Okay. Okay, cool. Now I assume this one is a bit of a stretch, right? Because in terms of the example, because it's not really related to player safety, right? This is like a promotional or marketing example, right,
Mhm.
Mike? I assume you're sharing this because maybe you don't have an example of a time you had to update a player safety policy that backfired, right?
Yeah, so I didn't want to rely on the example that I talked about previously, which was that Amnesty win back campaign that happened,
Uh-huh.
which was
Uh-huh.
was a promotional context or promotional background of win back, but it had the sort of negative because there was some stuff that backfired on from that as well, just in terms of players, bad folks coming back into the game and just immediately being bad again.
Yeah.
So it did create some friction in the player base there. So that is, I'd say, would be a stronger example, but I just didn't want to keep kind of hammering back the same point.
Yeah. Actually, I think in this case, that one was actually okay to bring up again, only because you didn't actually talk about the risks involved and then how you had mitigated that. So even though
Hmm.
it's the same example, we actually never talked about risks and risk mitigation.
Hmm.
So I think it actually would have been okay to share.
Okay.
Um, but but for those who are, applying for a role in which you may not have an example when they ask you something super direct, like in Albert's question here, do the best you can. Like with Mike, he took a similarly related example of a time he rolled out something that had backfired, and then how they handled it, and then mitigated the risks moving forward. So because that's the best you can do, right? If you don't have a specific example that matches exactly what they asked for, then you got to find something else. Okay, let's try another one of these project management questions because that is part of this role as well. Um, can you can you tell me about a time where you were helping roll out some changes, um, and you ran into a problem, and how you were able to remove that milestone and keep the project moving forward?
Yeah, so trying to think about this for a second. There was a project that we were running to promote streamers in North America that was basically like a repost chain. It's called the scavenger hunt, and it was essentially this streamer goes on, gives you a code, you get some in-game goods. He tells you what streamer to watch tomorrow, and that would go on for about a month. This we had run this project. It was I came up with this project, and I had run it several iterations of it for North American players for a few months, kind of revising it based off of feedback and coming to a version I was pretty happy with. Once they announced that we were merging with Europe, um, the project and the accompanying in-game events that triggered based off of the code redemptions, everything that was programmed in, both on the Twitch side and the in-game side, was all ready to go and approved. However, the stakeholder who had to give it the final, let's say, give it the final thumbs up, actually hit the button to publish the event and make it run, just randomly decided that they don't like it. So over the course of the next several months, it involved reaching out to this stakeholder who was extremely difficult to get in touch with, over and over, going sort of circumventing them as professionally as possible, and attempting to get all of the pieces for this project, sort of anticipate and ahead of time all the potential complaints that this project manager could have with this project. Which, so some that would come to mind would be, it was only for North American streamers. It was in bad time zones for European players. Some players would simply copy paste the codes without actually watching, which were all potential risks involved. But the BI data, the business intelligence data from previous iterations of the campaign, all showed that despite these potential risks, the engagement metrics for participating players were positive. Everything was positive for number of logins, average number of sessions daily. So there was data backing the methodology here, and essentially preparing a project plan that preemptively had points acknowledging all of these potential risks. So identifying the risks ahead of time, and either mentioning how they're not risks or ways to mitigate those risks, or why those risks don't necessarily, like that, why despite those risks the results of the project is positive, like regardless, if that makes sense. So there's a little bit of all of that involved, and then ultimately getting buy-in from all the leadership, and then successfully running this project both for a North American and European audience, and seeing positive growth metrics for both the participating content creators, and seeing positive engagement metrics for participating players who participated in the activity.
Okay. And then if you had to do the project again, is there anything you would do differently?
I think just the big takeaway from that experience is, anticipate potential risks and anticipate blockers. So just doing as much prep as possible to identify and list, and preemptively come up with ways to mitigate potential risks, so that before that risk is even brought up by someone who will then use it as a reason not to approve this idea or activity or project, demonstrate ahead of time that those risks aren't necessarily going to, I guess, going to doom that project idea
Hmm.
in the end.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Good. This is great. Um, STAR, very clear. Result was good. You had numbers. You talked about project management skills. So I think it was great. Good answer.
Cool, cool, cool.
And let's do Albert's second question. Are there any player safety policies from other gaming companies of which you disagree with? Which ones, why, and how would you change them?
Absolutely. There's one that immediately comes to mind. I used to play a ton of League of Legends, and League of Legends has a notoriously toxic gaming community. I used to be one of those toxic gamers, I know. Um, their Riot Games policy on chat violations is, in my opinion, toxic because they are one of the few gaming companies that will permanent issue permanent game suspensions and revoke access to accounts for chat violations. I pretty firmly believe that uh, if a player loses their ability to chat and doesn't have other ways to grief and troll and disrupt the game for other players, and if they simply continue to play without communicating, they should have the right to do so. Especially when their accounts typically involve a lot of microtransactions for in-game content, skins, etc. Like players have that holds value to players, and someone who is potentially really toxic and can't control their temper, but otherwise doesn't disrupt the game outside of chat, I feel is still contributing to revenue. They're still potentially referring their friends. They're still driving positive KPIs that you want to influence. And I on a sort of an ideological level, I grew up in the 90s. Like I feel like there's always a little bit of playful shit talking, obviously within reason, involved with being a gamer. So I think there's a bit of that, there's always that's always going to be part of online gaming, and as long as there's steps to discourage it and mitigate it in a way that it doesn't disrupt the game for other players, I don't think that access should be revoked, especially when those are potential paying customers that you're kicking out.
And so what changes would you make to the particular policy? And then how would you address the original problem which Riot is trying to solve, which is the, I guess, inappropriate chat
Hmm.
that players may feel,
Right.
makes them unsafe.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry. So I mean ultimately like I would revise that policy so that permanent game bans aren't issued for chat violations. They could be escalating game bans of continuing, severity. If the bigger stick deterrent method is, if there's any logic to that. But ultimately, I think that just chat violations should culminate in chat suspensions, and if there's game violations that occur because because they can't abuse chat, they abuse the game. Well, then there are sanctions in place to issue game bans then for that in-game violation. So simple change in policy, I think it would be ultimately positive. And then in order to mitigate that type of behavior, I'm a firm believer in sort of praise publicly, punish privately. Give players, there's already a system in place for players to give commendations, which gives gives a little banner on their name with a different color and little things like that that don't necessarily make that big of a difference. But implementing as many of these carrots as possible. Say seasonal rewards for players who don't get any bans or warnings, for the course of a competitive gaming season or something like that. Little incentives. Players are always like. I feel like the best way to motivate players is to give them things rather than to hit them with a stick or take things away from them.
Okay. And then someone in the chat asks, would you eventually give chat access back?
I think that's a tough question. I think there needs to be a point at which it's simply permanently cut off. A great example of that would be threats of real life violence. If a player sends you a message telling you in detail how they're going to do harm to you or your family, that in my or like severe racism, something like that. Like there are things that would be considered extremes, and I think those should qualify for a permanent suspension of chat. And if a player, there are those types of players who will then go and act out in game and attempt to grief as a result of not being able to grief in chat. So ultimately it might drive a little bit of that behavior in the short term. But there is also a chunk of players that I feel would reform, given that sort of that last chance to keep all of their in-game goods in their account and their history and all the sort of the prestige that comes with being a gamer. If you're playing a game that your stats and things like that matter to you.
Okay, good. Great. I have no feedback on this one. I think it was very well organized. You talked about how you would mitigate. Obviously, I had to do one follow-up question, but I think other than that, it was very comprehensive. So great. that's everything I had on my end. Everyone, please give Mike a huge round of applause for giving us all these great answers and helping us practice some of these player safety and community questions.
Thank
And
you.
again, if you want to volunteer, please contact Albert. We are looking for other volunteers. I think we have one scheduled for next week, but then we're free the week after that. And if you want to watch other mock interviews, please check out the Albert's List YouTube channel and the Career Shakers YouTube channel.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much, Corey. Corey said it all. Follow us on YouTube. We'll have a recording up. And if you're interested in doing mock interview, please reach out and we will have you soon. Thanks, everyone, and have a really great night. Bye.
Thanks, guys.